The doorbell of a $500,000 home in a quiet English village rings, and the world ends in a 500,000-volt surge. Sadie Hartley, a successful businesswoman, opened her front door expecting a late delivery, but she was met with a high-tech assassination. This wasn't a robbery gone wrong or a random act of violence. It was a calculated mechanical execution. A 55-year-old mother, paralyzed in seconds, then left to face a silent, obsessive killer who had been tracking her every move for years. Please support the channel by subscribing and liking this video. Thank you so much. Sadie Hartley was the embodiment of grace and hard-won stability. At 55, she had built a life that many in the rainy, rolling hills of Lancashire envied. She wasn't just a resident of the affluent village of Helmshire, she was a pillar of it. As the director of a successful medical communications company, Hartley Taylor, Sadie lived in a world of precise details, high-level logistics, and professional excellence. Her daily life was orchestrated with the same care she gave to her multi-million-dollar contracts. Her home on Sunnybank Road was a reflection of that success, a sprawling 6-bedroom stone house nestled against a backdrop of green valleys. It was a place of warmth, often filled with the sounds of her children, her partner Ian, and the steady, rhythmic life of a woman who had finally found her rhythm. In the offices of her firm, the air was thick with the quiet hum of computers and the scent of expensive linen and fresh-cut flowers. Sadie was a woman who appreciated the finer things, but she never wore her wealth loudly. It was in the quality of her leather handbag, the steady click of her heels on the polished floor, and the way she could command a boardroom with a soft-spoken directive. Outside of her professional life, she was a fixture in the equestrian community. The smell of hay, leather, and horsehair was as familiar to her as the crisp pages of a medical journal. She found peace in the stables, away from the digital noise of the 21st century. Her life was full, rich with the history of her 2 grown children and the promise of a future with Ian Johnston, the man who had brought a new spark to her middle years. There was no room in Sadie's world for chaos. She didn't seek the spotlight. She simply radiated a quiet power that commanded respect. Then there was Sarah Williams. To those who saw her in the fluorescent light of her day job as a customer service advisor for a local bank, she was unremarkable. A 34-year-old woman with a penchant for outdoor sports. But Sarah lived in the friction between who she was and who she believed she deserved to be. She was a woman defined by her obsessions. Her biography is a study in high-altitude ambition and low-level deception. As a younger woman, she had been a standout on the slopes. She was a regular at the Chill Factor indoor ski slope in Manchester, where the artificial snow and recycled air became her second home. Those who watched her ski noticed a frightening level of commitment. She didn't just glide, she attacked the mountain. The sound of her metal edges biting into the hard-packed ice was a violent, rhythmic scraping, a sound that seemed to soothe the internal static that plagued her. In the skiing world, she was a level 4 instructor, a title she wore like armor. But when she stepped off the ice, the armor didn't fit the suburban life she occupied in Chester. Sarah's home was a paradox. On paper, she was a customer service advisor, a role that involved pacifying disgruntled bank customers over the phone. Yet her lifestyle told a different story. She lived in a house she had purchased with the help of a much older, wealthy man she referred to as her hardman. This relationship was less about love and more about leverage. Sarah understood the value of assets. She was a woman who looked at the world through a lens of acquisition. If she saw something she wanted, a car, a house, a man, she didn't consider the obstacles. She only considered the strategy required to take it. Her internal life was a cold, quiet place. She possessed a terrifying ability to compartmentalize. She could spend 8 hours being the helpful voice on the end of a telephone line, and then spend the evening meticulously stalking her romantic rivals online. She was a digital ghost, moving through social media profiles with a hunter's patience. Her physical appearance was meticulously maintained, slim, athletic, with hair often pulled back tightly, emphasizing the sharp, hawkish features of her face. There was a lack of warmth in her interactions, a calculated politeness that never quite reached her eyes. She felt the world owed her a certain level of luxury and devotion, and anyone standing in the way of that was not just an inconvenience, but an enemy. While Sadie was building a legacy of kindness and professional success, Sarah was nurturing a garden of resentment, watering it with every perceived slight and every rejection she had ever faced. She saw the world as a place of scarcity, where for her to have everything, someone else had to lose it all. The contrast between the two women couldn't have been more stark. One was a builder, the other a destroyer. One lived in the light of her own achievements, while the other sat in the shadows, calculating the distance between her current reality and the life she felt she had been robbed of. The Chill Factor in Manchester is a surreal monument to human stubbornness, a massive, sloping refrigerator that defies the gray, temperate drizzle of northern England. Inside, the temperature is kept at a constant 24 degrees Fahrenheit, and the air is dry, smelling faintly of ozone and synthetic snow. This was where Sarah Williams spent her time, carving aggressive lines into the artificial piece. It was here, amidst the hum of high-powered cooling fans, that she met Ian Johnston. Ian was a fireman, a man who projected the rugged, reliable energy of someone who lived for the outdoors. He was 23 years Sarah's senior, but to a woman who viewed relationships as strategic acquisitions, the age gap was irrelevant. To Sarah, Ian was the missing piece of the life she felt she deserved. He represented the virile, active lifestyle she craved, a stark contrast to the comfortable, stagnant security she maintained in her other life. For years, Sarah had been living a carefully constructed lie. She was the mistress of David Hardwick, a 75-year-old businessman she called her Hardman. David was her benefactor, the man who had bankrolled her existence, purchasing her home in Chester for nearly $100,000 and providing her with a weekly allowance of over $400. He treated her to lavish vacations and expensive cars, including a $30,000 Volvo. In David's presence, Sarah was the compliant, grateful companion, but as soon as she stepped onto the artificial snow of the ski slope, she became a predator. She pursued Ian with a quiet, relentless intensity that he initially mistook for genuine passion. Their affair was born in the cold, but it burned through Sarah's life like a wildfire. She became consumed by the idea of him, not just as a lover, but as a prize. However, Ian was already in a long-term committed relationship with Sadie Hartley. Sadie was everything Sarah was not: emotionally mature, financially independent through her own merit, and deeply respected by everyone who knew her. When Ian tried to pull away from Sarah to focus on his life with Sadie, the rejection didn't just hurt Sarah, it insulted her. She couldn't understand why Ian would choose a 55-year-old woman over a 34-year-old athlete like herself. In Sarah's mind, life was a zero-sum game, and Sadie Hartley was the person who had stolen her winnings. The obsession didn't happen overnight. It was a slow, toxic buildup, a psychological rot that started with monitoring Ian's movements and ended with a desire to dismantle Sadie's life piece by piece. In September 2014, Sarah decided to strike her first blow. She composed a letter of revelation, intended to incinerate Sadie's world. In this document, she detailed her affair with Ian in graphic, clinical detail. She wrote to Sadie as if she were doing her a favor, explaining that her partner was a liar and a cheat who didn't deserve a woman of Sadie's stature. The letter was designed to trigger an immediate, explosive breakup. Sarah sat back and waited for the phone call, the moment Ian would realize his mistake and come crawling back to the woman who truly understood him. But the explosion never happened. Sadie, a woman of immense poise and intelligence, sat Ian down and confronted him. They talked, they argued, and then they chose to stay together. They chose to work through the betrayal, solidifying their bond and effectively erasing Sarah Williams from their future. This was the ultimate humiliation. Sarah had played her strongest card, and the world had barely blinked. She found herself marginalized, blocked from Ian's life, and relegated to the shadows. It was at this point that her obsession shifted from the romantic to the homicidal. She began to spend her evenings in the company of her only true confidant, Katrina Walsh. Katrina was an eccentric 56-year-old, a fellow horse enthusiast who lived in a house overflowing with clutter and animal hair. She was a woman who seemed to exist on the fringes of society, and she provided Sarah with the perfect sounding board for her darkest impulses. Together, they formed a feedback loop of resentment. Sarah began to track Sadie Hartley like a scientist observing a specimen. She spent hours on social media, cataloging Sadie's work trips, her equestrian events, and the layout of her home in Helmshore. She even went so far as to drive the 35 miles from Chester to Helmshore in the middle of the night, just to sit outside the house on Sunnybank Road and watch the lights go out. She wanted to know the rhythm of Sadie's life, when she walked the dogs, when she left for the office, and when Ian was away. Sarah wasn't just angry, she was becoming a student of Sadie's existence. She used sophisticated GPS trackers, attaching them to Ian's car to monitor his visits to Sadie's home. She watched the little red blip on her computer screen move through the Lancashire valleys, each movement a fresh needle to her ego. The psychological landscape Sarah occupied was becoming increasingly detached from reality. She didn't see herself as a criminal. She saw herself as a victim of a great injustice. She believed that by removing Sadie, she was simply correcting a mistake in the universe. In her mind, Sadie was a barrier, a physical obstacle that needed to be cleared so that Sarah could resume her rightful place. The triangle was no longer a matter of two women and a man. It had become a hunt. And while Sadie Hartley was busy planning medical conferences and tending to her horses, Sarah Williams and Katrina Walsh were in a cluttered kitchen in Chester, beginning to discuss the mechanics of a mission that would end in blood. The transition from a jilted lover to a dark architect of murder was complete. The air in Sarah's world was now as cold and artificial as the snow at the chill factor, and she was ready to descend. The blueprint for the death of Sadie Hartley was not drawn in a clean professional studio, but amidst the chaotic squalor of Katrina Walsh's home in Chester. To understand the planning, one must understand the relationship between Sarah Williams and the woman she called her best friend. If Sarah was the cold, calculating mind, Katrina was the willing hands, a woman so desperate for connection that she allowed herself to be drafted into a murder mission as if it were a dark role-playing game. Katrina's house was a sensory nightmare, a hoarding ground filled with horse tack, animal cages, and the overwhelming scent of unwashed laundry and old hay. It was here, surrounded by the physical debris of a fractured life, that the two women began to document their descent. Katrina Walsh kept a diary. It was a meticulous, rambling record of their conspiracy, written with a chilling nonchalance that suggested she viewed the impending assassination as a grand adventure. In these pages, she referred to their plan as Mission Impossible. She wrote about the need for perfect timing and the removal of the woman who stood in Sarah's way. The planning was tactical, clinical, and devoid of any moral friction. Sarah Williams didn't just want Sadie Hartley gone, she wanted her erased with mechanical precision. This required tools that were not available on the high streets of suburban England. In December 2015, the planning moved across international borders. Sarah and Katrina boarded a ferry and drove to Darmstadt, Germany. The purpose of this trip was purely logistical. Under the guise of a pre-Christmas getaway, they sought a weapon of tactical paralysis. Sarah had researched the effects of high-voltage electricity on the human nervous system. She didn't want to struggle. She wanted immediate, total compliance. In a specialized store, she purchased a 500,000-volt stun gun, a device designed to deliver a massive, non-lethal shock that would lock the muscles and drop a grown adult to the floor in less than a second. In the UK, this device was a prohibited weapon, a Section 5 firearm. To Sarah, it was a necessary component of her strategy. She tested the device, listening to the sharp, blue crackle of electricity jumping between the metal prongs, a sound that promised the power to silence Sadie Hartley before she could even scream. While in Germany, the dark architect also focused on surveillance. Sarah purchased a series of GPS trackers, small magnetic boxes no larger than a pack of cigarettes. Back in England, she used the darkness of early morning to creep toward Ian Johnston's car. With a practiced, steady hand, she attached the magnet to the undercarriage. This blip on her screen became her window into the life of her target. For weeks, Sarah sat in her living room, bathed in the blue light of her computer, watching Ian's movements. She saw every trip he took to Helmshore. She saw how long he stayed at the house on Sunnybank Road. She calculated the distance, 35 miles from her doorstep to Sadie's. and learned the exact time it took to navigate the winding Lancashire backroads. She was looking for a window of opportunity, a moment when Ian would be away, leaving Sadie alone and vulnerable in that large stone house. The murder kit was assembled with the same obsessive attention to detail. Sarah didn't use her own bank accounts for the sensitive purchases. She utilized David Hardwick's money, the funds provided by her elderly benefactor, to buy the tools of her crime. She purchased a pair of heavy-duty tactical boots from a local shop, boots that were a size too large, intended to create confusing footprints at the scene. She bought a burner phone, a device that would never be linked to her identity, to coordinate with Katrina. They even bought specific clothing, dark, nondescript layers that would help them blend into the shadows of the rural valley. On January 6, 2016, 8 days before the murder, Sarah decided to conduct a dry run. She needed to know how Sadie would react to a late-night visitor. She purchased a bouquet of chrysanthemums from a local supermarket and drove the 35 miles to Helmshore. It was a cold, damp evening, the temperature hovering around 38 degrees Fahrenheit. She walked up the driveway of the Sunnybank Road property and rang the bell. When Sadie Hartley opened the door, Sarah stood there, anonymous and polite, handing over the flowers. She claimed they were a thank you from a neighbor. In reality, it was a reconnaissance mission. Sarah was checking the line of sight from the front door. She was testing the response time. She was looking for security cameras and assessing the strength of the door's latch. Most importantly, she was looking into the eyes of the woman she intended to kill. Sadie, ever the professional, accepted the flowers with a smile and a thank you, never suspecting that the woman on her porch was measuring the space where she would soon take her final breath. In the final days of the planning phase, the air between Sarah and Katrina grew thick with the anticipation of the mission. They discussed the disposal of evidence, the cleaning of the car, and the need for a solid alibi. Sarah's internal world was now entirely synchronized with the cold, mechanical process she had set in motion. She had accounted for every variable: the voltage of the stun gun, the tracking of the vehicle, the layout of the hallway. She viewed Sadie Hartley not as a human being with a family and a career, but as a technical problem that required a tactical solution. The GPS blip on her screen showed that Ian Johnston was planning a skiing trip to Switzerland. He would be out of the country. The house on Sunnybank Road would be quiet. The window had opened. The planning was over, and the execution was about to begin. January 14th, 2016 was a Thursday, a day that began with the mundane rhythms of a working week and ended in a calculated explosion of violence. In the village of Helmshore, the evening air was thick with a cold, clinging fog. The temperature had dropped to a biting 36 degrees Fahrenheit, and a fine, persistent drizzle turned the stone-paved streets into slick, dark ribbons. Inside the house on Sunnybank Road, Sadie Hartley was settling into the quiet isolation of her home. Her partner, Ian, was thousands of miles away, navigating the bright, frozen slopes of the Swiss Alps, a fact that Sarah Williams knew with absolute certainty because she had spent the previous weeks watching the tracking data on her computer screen. Sadie was alone, catching up on professional correspondence in her study, the house warm and filled with the soft, amber glow of floor lamps. It was a scene of utter security, a security that was about to be systematically dismantled. 35 miles away in Chester, Sarah Williams was preparing for the mission. She didn't move with the frantic energy of a crime of passion. She moved with the steady, chilling competence of a technician. She dressed in the layers she and Katrina had purchased, dark, nondescript clothing designed to swallow her silhouette in the Lancashire night. She pulled on the tactical boots, the ones that were 2 sizes too large, intended to leave a trail of misleading evidence in the damp soil of Sadie's garden. She checked the stun gun, the 500,000-volt device she had smuggled across the English Channel. She listened to the sharp, blue snap of the electrodes, a dry electric crackle that promised the power to override a human being's very will to move. She placed the device in her pocket along with a kitchen knife she had sharpened to a razor's edge. There was no hesitation. There was no second guessing. She climbed into the Renault Clio, a car Katrina had helped her procure specifically for this night, and began the hour-long drive toward the Pennine Hills. As the car climbed into the higher elevations of the Rossendale Valley, the world outside Sarah's windshield became a blur of gray stone and dark trees. She navigated the winding back roads with a hunter's familiarity, avoiding the main arteries where traffic cameras might capture her license plate. She parked the car several streets away from Sunnybank Road, tucked into a shadow where the streetlights didn't reach. The walk toward Sadie's house was silent. The only sound was the rhythmic squelch of the oversized boots on the sodden grass and the distant, muffled hum of the nearby highway. Sarah approached the side of the house, moving through the garden with the confidence of someone who had studied the blueprints of the property until they were etched into her retinas. She reached the front porch at exactly 8 p.m. The doorbell chime echoed through the silent hallway of the Hartley home. Sadie, likely expecting a late working colleague or perhaps a neighbor with a delivery, stood up from her desk. She walked toward the door, her footsteps light on the polished wood. She reached for the handle, perhaps wondering who would be calling on such a miserable, rainy evening. She pulled the door open, and the world ended in a blinding blue arc. Sarah didn't speak. She didn't offer a warning or a demand. As soon as the door moved, she lunged forward, pressing the metal prongs of the stun gun directly against Sadie's chest. The 500,000-volt surge hit Sadie with the force of a high-speed collision. In an instant, her central nervous system was hijacked. The electrical current overrode the signals from her brain to her muscles, locking her limbs in a state of rigid, agonizing paralysis. She didn't scream. She couldn't. The muscles in her throat and chest seized, trapping the air in her lungs. She collapsed backward into the hallway, hitting the floor with a heavy, sickening thud. This was the mechanical efficiency Sarah had planned for. While Sadie lay on the floor, conscious but utterly unable to move, her eyes wide with a terror that found no outlet in sound, Sarah stepped over the threshold and closed the door behind her. The house was quiet again, save for the hum of the refrigerator and the ticking of a clock in the kitchen. Then, the silence was broken by the wet, rhythmic sound of the knife. The attack was a frenzy of calculated brutality. Sarah didn't just want Sadie dead. She wanted to destroy the vessel that had held Ian's affection. She delivered 41 stab wounds in a matter of minutes. Sadie's body, still partially paralyzed by the initial shock, could offer only the most basic, instinctive resistance. There were defensive wounds on her hands, small, deep cuts where she had tried to grab the blade in the final seconds of her life. But the high-voltage surge had stolen her strength. The blood pooled on the expensive rugs, a stark, crimson contrast to the orderly, beautiful home Sadie had built. When the task was finished, Sarah stood in the hallway, her breathing steady, looking down at the silence she had created. She didn't linger. She checked her clothing for visible stains, adjusted her dark layers, and walked out the front door, pulling it shut with a soft, final click. She walked back to the Renault Clio, driving away from Helmshore as the rain continued to wash the streets. She met Katrina Walsh at a pre-arranged location in a remote area of the countryside. Together, in the darkness, they began the process of decontamination. They burned the outer layers of clothing in a fire that hissed and spat in the damp air. They disposed of the oversized boots and the stun gun, burying the components in a location they believed would never be found. The next morning, Sarah Williams arrived at her job at the bank at 9 a.m. She spoke to customers with the same helpful customer service voice she used every day. She took her lunch break. She smiled at her colleagues. She moved through the world as if the previous night had been nothing more than a dream. While back in Helmshore, the lights remained on in a silent house on Sunnybank Road, and Sadie Hartley lay in her hallway, waiting to be found. The silence at Sunnybank Road was finally broken on the evening of Friday, January 15th, nearly 24 hours after the blue arc of the stun gun had first flickered in the hallway. A colleague of Sadie's, concerned after she failed to attend a scheduled meeting or answer a barrage of urgent messages, arrived at the house. Finding the front door unlocked, she stepped into the foyer and was met with a scene that would haunt the local constabulary for years. The hallway, usually a space of warm welcomes and expensive rugs, was a frantic map of violence. Sadie Hartley lay where she had fallen, the sheer brutality of 41 stab wounds telling a story of hatred that went far beyond a simple burglary. When the Lancashire police arrived, the initial atmosphere was one of profound confusion. There were no signs of forced entry. The house hadn't been ransacked. Jewelry worth thousands of dollars remained untouched on the bedside tables. This was an execution, not a heist. The lead detectives looked for a motive in Sadie's professional life, questioning business rivals and disgruntled former employees, but every lead dissolved into the quiet, professional respect Sadie had commanded. Then, the focus shifted to the man who was missing from the frame, Ian Johnston. Ian was reached in the Swiss Alps, where the temperature was a biting 10 degrees Fahrenheit. His shock was immediate and seemingly genuine, but in the world of homicide, the partner is always the first person under the microscope. However, Ian's alibi was ironclad, verified by international flight records and the digital breadcrumbs of a ski resort's lift passes. It was during his initial interview that he dropped the name that would change the trajectory of the entire case, Sarah Williams. He told the investigators about the obsessive younger woman, the letter of revelation, and the persistent, low-level harassment that had plagued his relationship with Sadie. The digital dragnet began immediately. Detectives pulled the records for Ian's vehicle and discovered a startling anomaly. A magnetic GPS tracker had been attached to the undercarriage of his car. This was the first hint of the high-tech stalking Sarah had employed. Simultaneously, forensic experts began scouring hours of CCTV footage from the narrow lanes of Helmshore. They were looking for a ghost, and they found one in the form of a silver Renault Clio. The car was spotted moving through the village on the night of the flower delivery dry run, and again on the night of the murder. The vehicle was eventually traced not to Sarah, but to an eccentric 56-year-old woman named Katrina Walsh. On January 17th, the police moved. Sarah Williams was arrested at her home in Chester. When the officers arrived, she was in bed, reportedly listening to Total Eclipse of the Heart, a choice of music that detectives would later describe as a chillingly appropriate anthem for her obsession. Her reaction to being charged with murder was a void of emotion. She didn't cry. She didn't protest her innocence with the frantic energy of the wrongly accused. She simply sat in the back of the patrol car, her face an icy mask of indifference. She offered no information, answering every question with a rehearsed, clinical, no comment. The breakthrough, however, didn't come from the dark architect. It came from the willing hands. Katrina Walsh was taken into custody, and unlike Sarah, she was a chaotic variable. She initially attempted to play the role of a woman suffering from profound memory loss, claiming she couldn't remember where she was or what she had done. But her house in Chester told a different story. During a massive forensic search of Katrina's cluttered, animal-scented home, officers climbed into the attic eaves. There, hidden beneath piles of equestrian gear and old blankets, they found a plastic bag containing a collection of notebooks. These were the diaries of a conspirator. In a discovery that felt like something out of a Gothic novel, the investigators realized that Katrina had documented nearly every step of the Mission Impossible. The entries were written in a sprawling conversational hand, detailing the mission with a nonchalance that bordered on the psychopathic. She wrote about the trip to Germany to buy the hardware, the 500,000-volt stun gun. She described the reconnaissance trips to Helmshore. One particularly harrowing entry detailed how they had spent hours in a local park, practicing their movements and discussing how to decontaminate themselves after the hit. The diary wasn't just a confession, it was a roadmap of the premeditation. It proved that this wasn't a sudden outburst of rage, but a cold-blooded project that had been in development for over 17 months. The diaries led the police to a local farm and a nearby lake. Divers braved the freezing, murky waters to recover the murder kit. They found the stun gun, the kitchen knife, and the tactical boots Sarah had worn. Forensic analysis of the boots revealed a microscopic but undeniable link. A trace of Sadie Hartley's blood was embedded in the tread. The perfect crime was beginning to fray at the edges. Digital forensics on Sarah's computer revealed the true depth of the stalking. She had searched for the perfect murder, how to disable a person with electricity, and buying a tracking device. She had spent hundreds of hours virtually walking the streets of Helmshore using Google Street View, memorizing every escape route and every blind spot in the village's surveillance. She had monitored Sadie's medical communications business, knowing exactly when the woman would be most vulnerable. As the detectives pieced together the timeline, the sheer arrogance of the killers became clear. They believed they were smarter than the system. They believed that by using a stun gun and oversized boots, they could outmaneuver the collective intelligence of the Lancashire police. But the mission impossible had left a trail of breadcrumbs across 2 countries. The diary, the Renault Clio, and the GPS tracker had transformed Sarah Williams from a jilted lover into a documented assassin. The investigation was closing in, and the cold, artificial snow of Sarah's world was finally beginning to melt under the heat of the evidence. The trial at Preston Crown Court was a study in cold, psychological detachment. Sarah Williams sat in the dock with a posture so rigid and an expression so void of life that she appeared more like an exhibit than a defendant. She watched the proceedings as if she were a spectator, never flinching even as the most gruesome forensic details were read aloud. The prosecution characterized her as a barbaric and obsessive architect of a 17-month slaughter. The star witness wasn't a person, but the ink-stained pages of Katrina Walsh's diaries, the smoking gun that stripped away any pretense of an accident. Katrina continued her performance of frailty and memory loss, but the jury didn't buy the act. In August 2016, the verdict was delivered with clinical finality. Both were found guilty of murder. Sarah Williams was sentenced to life with a minimum of 30 years, while Katrina Walsh received a minimum of 25. Justice was served, but it was a heavy, silent victory for a family that would never be whole again. Please like this video and share your thoughts about this case in the comments. Be sure to check out our previous videos as well. See you soon.